Hello, this is Dr. Olga Stevko, and today we are going to have a fascinating conversation on the topic perception versus reality. And here with me, there are 4 people to participate in this conversation. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, Dr. Olga. My name is Achille. I'm a former police officer, and I currently reside a couple hours away from Toronto, Ontario, Canada.
Thank
Hello,
you.
Hello, I'm Bohdan. I live in California, currently originally from Europe. I'm a former psychotherapist and currently, as of a decade, a filmmaker.
I'm Isaac. I live in Fort Collins, Colorado, and I work in technology.
I'm Owen. I work in arts and entertainment industries in Los Angeles, California.
Thank you. And I'm in a field of medicine and also in identifying and transforming unconscious programs that are formed as a result of genetic childhood trauma. And we are from so different fields. It will be so interesting to listen to everybody's angle of view for this topic. And I will start with my first question. I prepared some questions. Is our perception an accurate representation of what reality truly is? And I will start with Achille.
We were talking about this before we started recording, and I don't think our perception is accurate representation of what reality truly is. And I'll give a quick example. Like if you had a bucket of water that was, say, 20, I'll talk Celsius rather than Fahrenheit because I grew up in Canada, but say 20 degrees Celsius, and somebody was outside, it was freezing cold. They came inside and put their hand in that bucket of water, they would probably think it's warm. And on the flip side, if you had somebody who was out in like blistering hot weather, it was like 35 degrees Celsius, 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and they came inside and put their hand in that same bucket of water, they would probably think it's cool. So, and there's varying degrees of, coldness and warm, I guess. But so I don't think it's an accurate. I think reality, because that bucket of water stays the same. It's our perception that, sees whether or not it's cold or warm.
Thank you, Achille. And Owen?
I definitely agree with that, of course. And I think the question does raise kind of secondary question of how you define reality. Because certainly our perceptions can be, well, they're relative, just as Achille explained, and they can be flat out inaccurate. Someone who's having a schizophrenic episode might perceive all sorts of things that aren't actually there. On the other hand, it's impossible to escape your own perceptions. So while probably there is an objective reality that exists outside all of our perceptions, that can't actually be proven. And one's own perception really constitutes one's reality. So I think that while most likely there's an objective reality that differs from our perceptions in certain ways, on the other hand, our experience of perception is inextricably linked, or our experience of reality is inextricably linked to our perceptions. So it's hard to say that there is necessarily a reality outside of our own perception, since it can't necessarily be demonstrated.
Thank you, Owen. And Bohdan?
I think we perceive what is relevant to our survival as a priority number one. And the example I mentioned before was it takes about 200 milliseconds for the organism to respond with fight or flight response, and another 300 milliseconds to say, oh, it's just a hose. So the perception of an object that could threaten our life invigorates us with the fight or flight response. And it's better to err on the side of caution and misperceive, let's say, this object and respond before seeing, emotional response before cognitive appraisal happens, and survive this moment than to kind of wait for the accurate appraisal of the situation. So I think it's wired. Misperception is wired into us because it prioritizes survival. And so it's better to be safe than sorry, basically. It's just one example of many that tells me that perception, even sensory perception and reality that we perceive, is definitely not in the same space.
Thank you, Bohdan. Isaac?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is awareness of perception, awareness that perception can differ from reality. And I don't think perception will generally be an accurate representation of reality. In large part, many of the things I've already said here by everyone else are great examples. But more generally, I think, in many ways, in the best case, if best here refers to how accurate we can be, perception is an attempt to accurately accurately interpret and perceive reality, right? At that point, that becomes a little bit of a circular definition because it's a difficult definition to understand regardless. But the important thing is, I think, to understand, things like fight or flight. There needs to be an awareness that, oh, I am going to misperceive things. My perception may not necessarily be my reality. The thing I'm freaking out about might not actually be something worth freaking out about. But at the same time, you might not want to waste time doubting your instincts. So there's kind of also a question of, maybe, is it okay for perception to not be an accurate representation of reality? And maybe the answer to some degree is yes, in certain survival situations especially.
Thank you, Isaac. And all of your points of views are so interesting. And I would like to add from me to our conversation, our perception is true to us, and the reality it's an absolute truth. And our perception, it is as if subjective truth, and the reality is as if objective truth. And Gregory Bateson, who was an English anthropologist and also a social scientist and linguist, his quote was, "The map is not the territory." And what does it mean? And he referred to the map. It is our internal map, our filters that we perceive through. And the territory is just unfiltered, absolute reality. Are there any comments?
Which is unknowable. I think maybe we'll agree that it's unknowable to us. The reality is always going to be filtered, always, without a question. Maybe that's an obvious statement, but I think it's just kind of a foundational statement to make, that everything that is out there is a filter. The visible spectrum to us is also helpful because of survival, right? Like everything above and below doesn't necessarily help us so much. So this is the trait that was passed on, and there's a lot we don't perceive because it's not as high priority for survival again. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I'll add one thing there. Is like just Bohdan, you were talking about the garden hose on the ground, and if you think it's a snake, you may jump. But I think, you know, our interpretation, like if we love snakes, we may run towards the garden hose because we want to see what it is. If we hate snakes, you know, we're going to jump back and be quite fearful of it. So it's interesting how everything ties in together. Our perception, our filters, the sum of our experiences in life affect our perception, I guess.
Some things, though, like snakes, are, I believe I understand if correctly, wired into us. Some threats and dangers that were inherited through our ancestors that give us a better chance at survival. And snakes and spiders and things like that have been known to poison us and kill us. So
Yeah,
those ancestors
exactly.
backed off, kind of have maybe passed on that aversion to that thing.
Thank you.
Another interesting animal to think about are birds. I sometimes think about the fact that to us, like a pretty little songbird is, you know, it's a pretty animal. We like to look at it. We like to hear it sing. To a spider or some other bit of prey, it's an enormous descendant of the dinosaurs. It's a horrifying monster that's about to eat you. And what is the objective reality of the bird? You can't really say. Its reality is dependent on who's perceiving it.
Thank you. And my next question is, what does influence our perception? And I will start with Bohdan.
That's a big question, huh? What influences our perception? A whole long list of things, I believe, or I've observed at least in myself and others, my clients of the past. But it's we learn through experience, right? Because that helps us again survive and create patterns and sense of the world and quick shorthands for the world. Some experiences are deeply embedded in our nervous system, like trauma, for example. And all of that becomes a part of classifying, categorizing information that comes from outside and from inside as thoughts. And all of that is a giant soup of constantly, I think, evolving, like a goulash that's constantly evolving, that as new information comes in, new points of view, new analysis, sitting back, reconsidering a point of view, it's constantly evolving. And can you state the question again, because I got a little bit lost now.
What does influence our perception?
Experiences, degree of reflection, I think those two things. I think what we go through and how we think about what we go through. Maybe that's the quickest way for me to think about that.
Thank you. And Owen?
This is something we also touched on before recording. Mood can have a huge impact on our perception. And mood is a very strange phenomenon. And I think we often think about mood as sort of a almost trivial kind of side experience to the world. There's this thing about reality, and mood is, oh, you know, I'm in a good mood or bad mood, doesn't really matter because it's not material. But I'm increasingly thinking that mood is one of the most fundamental elements of reality, and much of our experience could be described as mood. So the example I used earlier is if you're in a good mood, someone cuts you off in the freeway, you might just think, oh, you know, he's probably in a hurry. Whereas if you're in a bad mood, you might think something very much less generous. So I would say mood is definitely a major influencer on our perceptions.
Thank you. And Achille?
Yeah, I agree with everything that was said. Like, you know, mood, our experiences, how we filter information that comes through, like emotionally, subconsciously. And since the subconscious is your kind of claim to fame, Dr. Olga, I've got a question for you about this. Then, like, how does the subconscious, how's that connected to reality and perception? And you know what I mean? Like, you know, obviously perception is deeply based on our filters and what we experience in life, and that's connected to the subconscious. So in your experience, what have you seen in regards to subconscious programs and changing somebody's reality?
Thank you for asking me this question, Akila. Actually, unconscious programs influence how people perceive themselves, other people, and the world around. And unconscious programs are formed as a result, actually, unconscious programs are formed as a result of different experiences. And only I worked on unconscious programs that are formed as a result of trauma that create issues and problems for people. Perception is unconscious. We are not perceiving consciously. It's all our autonomic nervous system is involved in order to perceive. And there is a self-perception and also a perception of other things and people and the world around us. And unconscious programs affect both, like self-perception, how we think and feel about ourselves. And for example, some people have low self-esteem. And perception of the world around is like affected by unconscious programs too. And also, what I would like to add, what I noticed, curiosity can change our perception. Even I observed more than one time that some people did not feel comfortable around some animal, but when they got curious and study more about that animal, that uncomfortable feeling disappeared. Isn't it interesting?
Very
Yeah.
much.
Isaac?
Yeah. I mean, I had a few thoughts, and I guess there were more things added, so my brain started thinking about different aspects of it. I guess one thing that just recently stood out, and I guess what you just mentioned was that I do think there's also a conscious aspect to perception. But I think I understand what your point is. Like even when you consciously perceive something, there's an unconscious aspect to it that underlies it, but primarily most of your perceptions are unconscious. I'm not sure if that's kind of what you meant. I just feel like there is a conscious element, and to kind of say that there isn't is almost to discredit that which maybe a lot of people value, their conscious perception, or at least their perception of how important their conscious perception is, let's say, which is fundamentally an unconscious perception. I had another thought at some point. I'll get back to you when I can remember it. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of differentiate that. I think there's also an aspect of, I wanted to look at that thing. I wanted to gather information about that thing, versus I gathered it unconsciously because there was programs in my mind that made me focus on it, even though I wasn't aware. Or maybe I was aware, but nonetheless.
Thank you, Isaac. I would like to add, I believe there are two components of perception, unconscious and conscious, as you said. And I think one of conscious components is what meaning do we give of what we perceived? And we are trying to analyze it consciously and to create this meaning. Are there any comments?
I'm thinking about the process of being engaged with someone in a conversation, let's say, and having an emotional response to something they're saying that is either overwhelming or intense or just out of sync with the moment in some sense. So something comes up emotionally, let's say, and I'm like, what the hell is that? What is that feeling? Where is it coming from? And another part of me starts to interpret the context. What did they say? What do I know about myself? And sort of interpret my emotion during in real time. I've done this many times in psychotherapy as a therapist in the end, because I would have reactions to clients and I wouldn't understand the feeling as it kind of came up. And so I had to kind of process it or bracket it, put it aside. But there was an unconscious experience that I employed, and willfully and intentionally my analytical mind to comprehend and categorize this emotion, to understand where I'm coming from. And I think it takes effort, intentional effort, to be conscious about the unconscious processes and there are millions of them at this very moment for all of us, that we're experiencing the chair we're sitting in, sounds that are triggering, scent that may be taking us back in time, all of this happening at all times. And I think it takes real intention, mindfulness to actually start perceiving things consciously, to become aware of our perceptions. And we can only do so much, that we have to focus our attention onto only such a small area sort of our perceptual phenomena as we are alive as humans. And there's so much that's below the surface at all times.
Yeah, if I just can add, like something popped into my mind here was like, even this conversation, like, we're given a question, and we all have a different answer based on our own experiences and how we perceive the information that we're sharing with each other. So that in and of itself kind of shows that, we interpret things very differently. Because if we didn't, we'd all have the same answer. You know what I mean? So very interesting.
Yes, thank you. Owen, would you like to add to this anything?
I've forgotten what question we're on right now.
It's what does influence our perception?
Oh, I was thinking, I wish I'd made a note of this, because I did recently hear some statistical fact about our perception, and just in terms of how many bits of information, this number is going to be off, but there's something like there's millions of bits of information coming into our senses at any time, and we're able to process, I can't remember, like 12 or something, in a second. That's way off. Don't quote me on that, but that's kind of the order of magnitude that we're dealing with. So, and I think it is clearly subconscious processes that have to filter that down from the millions of bits to the couple dozen or whatever. So, and that's even what our senses perceive is a tiny fraction of what's out there. Like Bohdan mentioned, the visible light spectrum. We see this little bandwidth, and it's just a tiny bit of all the electromagnetic radiation that's hitting us at every moment. And so our perception is necessarily limited to a tiny, tiny, tiny sliver of reality. And but I would agree with, I think all the things people have mentioned so far influence what it is we perceive. And I agree with Bohdan's point about, I'm sure he's right about the numbers for the milliseconds required to, you perceive the meaning of something first. I think this is kind of newly understood, but you do, as he said, first you go, oh, it's a dangerous snake, and you jump before your mind conceptualizes what the thing is, even if it is a dangerous snake, even if it's not a hose, and you go, oh, yep, that sure was a snake. You figure that out after having jumped away from the snake, which is sort of the reverse of what one might intuit. And it's also interesting because I think it's evidence that the subconscious deals with concepts, because whatever process is going, that's a dangerous, danger. Before you even think it's a snake, you go danger. But danger is a concept, and something in you had to perceive the snake in order to make the danger signal go off. And maybe that's hardwired, as he also said, that some predators are just hardwired. So, but there's still something conceptual happening faster than you can consciously create the concept. So I think that's very fascinating.
Yes, Bohdan.
Can I add to that? It was actually in a book I read this by Leslie Greenberg on he evolved this. He took Gestalt therapy and person-centered therapy and put it into emotional EFT, emotion-focused therapy, and he was actually using this example to say that emotion precedes cognition. That emotion comes because cognitive behavioral therapy versus emotion-centered focused therapy, and that was one of his arguments why he believes that emotion comes first, and then we apply our conscious cognitive processing on top of the emotional response.
Thank you, Bohdan. And I would like to add, you were talking about spiders and snakes. Isn't it interesting? Some people can have a tarantula as a pet and admire that tarantula and perceive that tarantula as being so beautiful and fun. And it's so exciting for them to watch the tarantula. And for other people, the same tarantula will be perceived as disgusting, horrible creature. And it's such a opposite two experiences, and it's how people perceive the same things. And it can be the same event, and there are several people will be perceiving completely different the same event and having a different mood, different reaction and response, right?
Almost diametrically opposed, almost two. It's not just like, oh, yeah, I kind of like this. No, it's some people on certain topics they can be completely opposite.
Yes. And my next question is how our perception affects us and our lives. I will start with Bohdan.
I'm smiling because I think it's nearly everything in the way from what I dreamt at night, the way I wake up into the morning, what I carry over, what we talked about before, the complexes from the night time, whatever is activated. If I perceive my body to feel heavy or whatever that day, on every level, my interpretation of reality, my place in the world, my purpose in life, I am constantly reinterpreting myself or my aim and direction in life, my identity, constant evolution, revolution. I'm constantly recycling ideas or rediscovering the same idea I've had 15 times before, but it became stale and unemotional and uninspiring. So it's everything. I feel like perception of self, perception of others. Where do I focus when I listen to someone? Am I listening to their text or subtext? It's like perceiving the information from the top or slightly below. Am I perceiving them as threatening or aggressive? Am I perceiving them as scared and therefore aggressive? So everything is, yeah.
Thank you. Achille?
Yeah, ditto. What Bohdan said. Our perception is everything in life, I think, and our perception changes as we interpret things and we grow in life and reflect on things. But yeah, it probably affects our mood. It ties into subconscious programs because there's some things that I may perceive in life through my subconscious programs that I've learned through you, Dr. Olga, that affect how I react to things, certain stimuli in life, how I interact with my friends and family and strangers, and how I drive down the street. It affects everything in life, I think, and even having a conversation with somebody. Yeah, so that was well said for sure, Bohdan.
Thank you, Achille. Owen?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think perception is kind of everything, although it does raise a little bit of a question of whether perception refers to the results of our perception or the process of perceiving. If it's the result, if it's the product of what we take in or process, and then it's kind of everything. You can't really distinguish perception from reality. But there is another way to, I think, conceive perception where you could look at it as the filter, as the mechanism, and then the product of perception might be conceived as something else. So the concepts that end up in your head, like I look at this lamp here, and the process of me deciding, or not necessarily deciding, but perceiving that it is a lamp, that might be separable from the concept of lamp that then ends up in my consciousness. So that's just maybe a distinction that could be explored. And I think that to give kind of the other side of the example of being in traffic and mood, I know I said that mood can affect your perceptions, but I think your perceptions or your mood is probably determined by your perceptions as well. So you might be in a bad mood because you've been on the freeway all day and dealing with a bunch of traffic. I would definitely agree with Bohdan that the perception is kind of everything. Although, as I said, you could maybe draw a distinction between the process of perception and the results of your perception.
Thank you, Owen and Isaac.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully I'm not ending up repeating too much of what was already said, because it's kind of you guys took a lot of the thoughts I had, but more generally, I wanted to say, like, the phrase perception is reality. I think it specifically refers to the effect on someone's life, because obviously, like, if someone perceives something that isn't really reality, we're not going to go and say that that is suddenly reality for everyone, but rather what we're really saying with that phrase is that someone's reality really is the perception they have of reality. And so in that sense, how does perception affect us? Well, it is our reality. So in the same sense as us living and, being real and interacting with things that we believe are real, that's just how people live. But I think an interesting thing might come into play when we think about what happens when someone later gains awareness that something they perceived as real wasn't real later, meaning they had one reaction or interaction a certain way towards it when they did perceive it initially, and then later on they understand something about that past event, and that in itself is an interesting long-term implication of how changed perception of reality can affect not only the present but also the perception of the past, which in some way affects the present, because many people are their sense of identity, their sense of their accomplishments and what they've done in life is in many ways tied to the things they've done in the past as well. So
thank you, Isaac. And I agree with all of you. And I just would like to add that perception would affect all areas of our lives and how we think, how we feel, how we behave, how we react, how we respond, even either we trust often even ourselves and trust others, and also decision making and your choice, all of that. And my next question is, does our perception affect our emotions? And I will start with Owen.
That ties into something that came to my mind while Isaac was speaking about perception being reality, in the sense of kind of we make the reality. So someone could hear someone else saying something, and if one is prone to hear, as you mentioned, Dr. Olga, if someone has low self-esteem, then one can be prone to hearing in criticisms, or someone has high self-esteem, you can be prone to hearing praise maybe or validation. And so you can hear someone speaking and you can maybe find little things that you could interpret as being criticisms or negative things, or you can find the things that seem like affirmations and positive things, and they both can be contained in the same person's speech or behavior. And whichever one you perceive, that's what you'll incorporate into your life. And you'll then make decisions based on that, like, oh, this person doesn't like me, or this person thinks I'm great, whichever one you choose, and then you'll make decisions and act based on that. So that emotional reaction you have will then determine the real events that follow in your life. So I would agree with Isaac's point on that.
Thank you. Achille?
Yeah, I think it completely does. Now, I was kind of, when Owen was talking and making some points, I was kind of thinking, like, does your emotional state affect the way you perceive things, or does your perception affect your emotional state? And that's a question I'll throw back to you, Dr. Olga, in the sense of tying that into the subconscious. You know what I mean? Like,
Yes.
what came first, the chicken or the egg? Like, because if I wake up in a bad mood, is that because I perceive something wrong at night or when I'm sleeping? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Both are true, I believe, what you said. And I believe that emotions are created on the unconscious level because of some unconscious programs that are formed as a result of stressful life events and trauma. And in this case, anything can trigger to feel certain way. For example, sad or fearful or angry. And when you feel that way, you'll be perceiving things differently too, compared to some people who feel neutral or who feel, for example, joyful. Because first, it's a perception, and after their back chemical molecules are forming emotions, and after people sense how it feels, they feel physically, somatically, those emotions.
So would you say it's kind of a loop then? Like, you know, so my perception affects my emotion, and my emotional state will affect my perception, and it goes around in like this dance of back and forth, ebb and flow. Would you say that's correct, or?
I believe so. I believe so.
Okay.
Bohdan, what is your opinion?
I'm thinking about the frame that I create for reality, which is the perception of, let's say I'm getting feedback on a screenplay or something, whatever, anything I create, let's say. And the person speaking back to me, giving me feedback, I will sit down and think, okay, this is coming from a constructive point of view. This is coming from a jealous point of view. This is coming from a, I don't know, superior point of view. I know more than you. And so I'm watching the person, I'm looking to see, okay, so where are they coming from? And now this is fascinating to me, this part here, is how flexible am I to experience this feedback and say, oh, they're just being jealous, versus, no, they make a really great point and I need to listen. And so how flexible am I emotionally to be able to perceive what is coming at me that may seem threatening or it may seem imposing or whatever else, and take it as neutral kind of, and consider it in a way neutral, and that's useful, let's say, as useful, consider it thoroughly, consider it against my perception, integrate that, try it out, doesn't work, okay, no, I think what I had was better, or no, well, this is great, I can include that and rewrite this scene, let's say. So the role of perception in emotion, I think, is fascinating to me, because I want to be the person or a person who has the ability to be emotionally flexible to perceive what's coming at me without filtering prematurely, let's say. Being as open-minded would be, I guess, the common term for this, in a way, open-hearted, open-minded. But the perception of what's coming at me, depending on how I perceive the sender, is going to form my filter, is going to inform and form my filter. And therefore my own growth and self-perception is going to be affected, depending on the whole range of possibilities that are humanly within the human range. I don't know if I tied that up clearly, but that the framing of reality, which is perception, changes reality. And then my active part, how can I participate in my perception actively to absorb, learn, grow, and transcend where I am now and grow? That's a fascinating question.
Thank you, Bohdan. I have two comments. One, that we create our own reality all the time, and living in that own reality. And it can be very pleasant, even that person is in a not pleasant environment. On the contrary, it can be unpleasant even being in a pleasant environment in reality. And I was thinking what you said about flexibility or not having flexibility. I believe it's a certain type of perception that makes some people flexible, kind of openness, whatever it is, and curiosity to know many points of view, not just one. I believe so. It's a certain type of perception.
And if we are closely bound, let's say, to an identity as, let's say, a screenwriter, whatever it happens to be, sculptor, then any kind of critique of the creation becomes a critique of the self, including political views, because their core beliefs. Attack on the core belief is an attack on your individuality. And I think that's why there's so much fire around people, political discourse, because we identify with our beliefs. And if you attack my beliefs, you're attacking me, and I'm getting into survival mode. And there's like kind of rage blindness that comes next. I'm threatened by annihilation because you're threatening my belief system, so I don't want to hear what you have to say. So I will reinforce my bias, kind of like what Owen was saying, that if I have high self-esteem, then I'll hear the compliments more than the critique, or maybe narcissism at that point, let's say, up there. Yeah.
Thank you, Isaac.
Yeah. I guess I was thinking about how perception almost creates this feedback loop of, perception can affect perception, which can affect perception, and so on and so forth. And I guess it's a combination of how much you let it affect you, and it might go in a good direction, it might go in a bad. And I think that's where awareness is just really important, so that if you have awareness of where you are, you can at any point go, okay, I need to slow down and I need to reevaluate what I am currently perceiving, because maybe it's taken you too far. And yeah, I mean, not sure if some of these aspects of, like the discussions we've had about like the politics aspect, when someone brings up something that is, something you identify with and you challenge, and you have that challenged, is that almost a, you perceive that you're being attacked, and maybe you try to handle it, but there's productive ways of handling it, which might be to actually listen and reconsider that maybe I don't need to have this be tied to me. But most of the time, what I think ends up happening is, as people said, but trying to add this kind of trying to see it as like a layer of way to look at this as like another layer on top, that layer being how they react to the perception, how the feedback loop occurs, and how they stop the feedback loop. in many cases, they go and focus on things other than the argument, right? And I think it's similar to the snake thing that we talked about earlier. It's before I actually evaluate what I'm hearing, I need to go and protect myself, right? And so they're protecting themselves from the destruction of the self, whether that's through venom or through their sense of self being completely invalidated.
Perfect. I really like that. Yeah.
Thank you. And I forgot whom I did not ask this question. Or everybody shared the opinion.
I think you asked everyone.
Okay, thank you. And my next question is, can our perception affect our health and well-being? And I will start with Bohdan.
Yeah, continues on to the emotional path, right? And then like just let's say stress, right? The effect we all know, or at least sense the effects of stress on well-being and health, chronic stress, constantly interpreting symbolic threats as existential threats, like failing a course is an existential threat to a student. Like I will die as a student if I fail in this program. And then the whole biochemical response to like it's not a bear anymore, it's a failed exam, but the body's gearing up to respond to it as if it was a existential threat. And that being constantly built into our symbolic structures in our environment, into our relationships, into our financial standings and securities, has incredible. I believe there's such a value in managing our emotions, to manage our health and our perceptions, therefore. So perception, emotion, health, kind of like that in that loop.
Thank you. Isaac?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would want to separate out indirect effects on health, because I think everything we've talked about now could be considered how perception indirectly affects our health, and focus more on how it directly affects our health. I mean, let me see how direct I can get it to be. So the immediate thing that comes to mind is you're trying to, I don't know if I should go the focusing on an assignment route or the exercise route, but perception can affect tension, right? And certainly if you're trying to exercise, too much tension can actually hurt you, right? You can more easily tear your muscles, even if it's not a matter of how flexible your muscles are, just a perception of something in that moment that causes you to tense up for no reason, perhaps in the middle of a rep, and that you can genuinely hurt yourself. So maybe that is one physical health aspect. Perhaps a harder aspect to prove would be, and I guess in some sense it's like I know it to be true. I don't have a formal proof of it. Is maybe the way in which a lot of our unconscious programs affect our perceptions, and that can lead to things like IBS, which actually no, it's quite well known that the stress that you feel in a moment can affect symptoms for those that have IBS, right? So that might be another way to see it. Can you say that the amount of stress you have is correlated with your perception? I certainly think so. And if that's the case, then I think that already shows plenty of ways that perception almost entirely directly affects your health. So yeah, I mean, those are just some things that came up off the top of my head for what I would say is very direct effects on health, because as I said, we've been talking about pretty much indirect effects on health from perception until now. So that's what I had in mind.
Thank you. Achille?
Yeah, I was thinking of a lot of things. Everyone's so far has brought up some really good points here. So I definitely think that's probably a true statement. And I don't know if you've heard of German New Medicine, and I think the philosophy behind that, the doctor found that trauma affects a lot of diseases and so forth in life are based on trauma and your body's reaction to that trauma. And I think that's tied into what we're talking about, perception, right? How we perceive that trauma, how we filter that trauma, and how your body kind of holds on to that trauma. I guess the question I have, maybe to you and to everyone else, is so it's that kind of the loop we're talking about. Okay, we perceive something, it affects our emotional state. It's probably based on our subconscious program, affects our health. So what is the root cause of that, of how we perceive that? Like, what is the root cause of that? Like, I know it could be, because we all had days, I know I have, and I speak for myself, where you just get into this like negative state, everything's going wrong, you're perceiving everything as negative, people are cutting you off on the road. Whereas other days, I may be kind of laid back and easy, everything's going right, there's a flow to it. So I'm kind of like trying to think, everyone's bringing up these really interesting topics and opinions and interpretations of perception. And I'm trying to kind of see what that kind of flow is between perception. It's kind of really made me think a lot about perception, emotions, stress, health, subconscious programming, and so forth. And I don't know if people want to comment on that, or you can offer your expertise on what you feel, how the interplay works.
I would like to answer your question. As I mentioned before, we perceive whatever is happening through filters of our unconscious programs. And there is a field in medicine, it called psychoneuroimmunology. And in this field, they shown that first people perceive some external situation or stimulus. And when it happens, the autonomic nervous system reacts. And when autonomic nervous system reacts, there are biochemical changes, for example, emotions and other changes. And after that, your immune system will respond. And because of that, if it happens often, there are consequences with health issues, to answer your question. And
Makes complete sense. Thanks, Dr. Olga.
thank you. Also, I would like to add, I wanted to mention before, also our perception, how we perceive, affects richness of our lives, like how our nervous system perceive. And it's amazing that some people live a dull life, flat, black and white, dull. And some people, what I experience with my clients, by changing some unconscious programs, it's a dramatic shift in perception of nervous system, the reality with richness. Like it becomes three-dimensional how people perceive. And more spectrum of color, more spectrum of sounds. People can like feel more. It's so amazing, and life becomes more enriched. And
Quickly wanted to ask something, just to be clear, like these cases of some people perceiving reality as more dull than others, this is across people living similar lives, right? Like financially, like
the same.
Yeah.
Situation, the same life, because how your nervous system perceive and processes, it will be completely different for different people experiencing the same experience with sound or color or touch. Doesn't make sense. And I didn't ask Owen, right? Your opinion.
Yeah, so much stuff just got brought up. the original question about how it affects our health. I jotted down a note. So I think that there's as Isaac said, the direct effects, like you can become stressed out, you can have these physiological reactions. And then there's also the way perception becomes reality through action. So, for example, if you don't perceive that fast food is bad for you, you might eat it all the time and be unhealthy compared to someone who can perceive that they shouldn't eat that all the time and might be relatively more healthy. So that's kind of the other side, the less direct action-based results of perception. And Achille's question made me think of a couple things. We talked about what's kind of the root of perception. I don't know if I can quite answer that, but it made me think of another concept that I think is important, which is attitude. And like mood, I've been having similar thoughts recently about attitude and mood, and they're words that I think we tend to think of as kind of trivial and immaterial, like, oh, he's got a bad attitude, he's got a good attitude. You know, it's just sort of like a surface level personality feature. I think that attitude is probably one of the most fundamental features of existence. And there's a reason we use that word, like in flying. An airplane's attitude refers to the direction it's going. There are a few different, describers of direction, but attitude is one way we describe it. And I think attitude is really, it's like a paradigm, and there's some sort of structure to our perceptions. Structure is a metaphor, obviously, but there's some way that our perceptions don't just, our sensory intake, there's a structure there. Our perception has a structure, and that structure can vary moment to moment, day to day. And I think attitude is one of the important ways we can try to describe that structure. Paradigm might be another useful word. But I think that's essential to attempting to understand perception, is understanding that there is some sort of structure internally that we adopt and that we hold, and that filters our experiences into perception. And I think another important concept is attention. What we pay attention to really determines our perception. And again, kind of that example of, whether you're noticing praise or criticism, which words do you pay attention to? Which mannerisms are you paying attention to? And or just going through life, are you paying attention to what's going on? I think attention is one of the most important features of life, and definitely determines our perception to a great extent. And of course, there's this loop, we're talking about the feedback loop, kind of what we decide to pay attention to is based on what we perceive in the world. So those are the thoughts that came up to me while we were talking about these things.
Thank you, Bohdan.
Just two things came to mind. One is a TED Talk I saw. It's called How to Make Stress Your Friend by I don't know if she's Dr. Kelly McGonigal. 10 years ago, 15 million views. I rewatched it recently, and basically she said, if you have the attitude that pressure is a privilege, that stress is just a motivating force, you're less likely to die by a certain percentage if you've had a serious event happen a year before. Don't quote me on the stats, but it's really worthwhile listening to this. And it's quite old, but it's worth seeing. That there was another study that I heard about people with who identified as having gluten sensitivity, were given food that didn't have gluten in it, but were told there was gluten in it, and they started having symptoms of gluten sensitivity following that. So the biology of perception and the symptomatology and all that just is such a powerful, and it's exciting at the same time, because if you can shape our perceptions, we can shape our quality of life and everything related.
Thank you. And my next question is, can our perception be changed? And also if you have some example of that. And I will start with Achille.
Yeah, I definitely think perception can be changed. And, I think even with reflection, like reflecting back on my life and, if you, even read a book, say that, you read 20 years ago on a topic and you read it now, you often you pick out or assimilate a lot of different things from that book because I've changed, my perception's changed, my view of life has changed. So I think we all are constantly kind of growing and learning, and our perceptions changing, hopefully for the better, and as we grow as people. So definitely, I think perception can changes. Can be changed, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you, Achille. Bohdan?
I guess it's the premise of psychotherapy to an extent that perceptions can change. And so that was a lot of my life was devoted to that process with myself and others. Personal example, well, I like what you just said about, I remember reading a book and underlining the book. And I was thinking, this is so cool, this is so important. And then 10 years later, rereading the book saying, obviously, the things I've underlined, I'm like, I thought this is really important. So the integration of the concepts or an example of watching a movie, No Country for Old Men in the movie theater when it came out, I was upset at the end. I was like, I paid money to watch sociopathy on the screen. And now it's one of my favorite films. I have a completely different way of perceiving that experience and the mastery in that film, in that movie. So those are superficial examples, but absolutely perception can be changed in my experience.
Thank you. Owen?
Yeah, I need to rewatch No Country for Old Men because I didn't really get that into it when I first saw it. So it's Coen Brothers, right?
Yes.
They're my favorites. Yeah, I totally agree. I think we have to assume and believe that perceptions can be changed, and I hope they can be changed consciously. So yeah, for sure, I agree with that.
Thank you. And Isaak?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been mentioned to some degree that, that's kind of what therapy is for. And I mean, I think more generally, trying to change a perception directly is probably not going to do it. It's usually going to be, I mean, given that they're mostly unconscious, it's going to be something that is going to be a process. You won't really know which perceptions will change how. I mean, your identity could change one day and perceptions you weren't aware you had will change, and you don't know the butterfly effect of all those things. But I think the first and most important step towards it all, like I've said throughout this podcast, is awareness, kind of having awareness of what are the most problematic perceptions that you tend to have a pattern of having, or maybe even what are the perceptions you have that have helped you throughout your life. And, through awareness of those things, I think it'll help someone grow, assuming they're open to it, in a way that will lead them to changes in their perceptions for the better of themselves, but maybe not in a way that they'll necessarily predict.
Thank you, Isaak. And very quickly, I will add that, yes, I agree, perception can be changed. And I observed that some people, when their perception of some person shifted, their relationship shifted with that person. And everybody, thank you so much for being here. I had such a good time talking on this topic.
Thank you, Dr. Olga. This is very interesting.
Olga. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone, for being here.
Thank you, and have a nice evening.